Hi, in this video, I'm going to go over this one logical reasoning question. This one comes from the first logical reasoning section of Prep Test 28. So on Law Hub, that's section 2, but the format of the original that would have been in section 1. Okay, so first I like to look at the question type. So the conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is added to the premises. So because we're adding something, and then when we do that, the conclusion will follow logically. What we're adding is a sufficient assumption. Okay, so it's going to strengthen the argument so much that we're going to be able to get to the conclusion. So whatever the gap is in the argument, whatever the flaw is, what we add to the premises will make the argument work so that the conclusion follows logically. Okay, so let's get into the argument. We want to identify the conclusion and identify the support. It would be great if we could also identify the gap or the flaw, so the reason why the support isn't enough to prove the conclusion, because then we know what it is that we need to fill or to fix in order to make the argument work. We might not see the flaw immediately or identify it precisely, but then when we look at the answer choices, it's important to think, okay, if I add this, what kind of impact would that have on the argument? Is it going to actually make the argument work? Okay, so we ought to pay attention only to the intrinsic properties of a work of art. Okay. We ought to pay attention only to the intrinsic properties of a work of art. Its other extrinsic properties are irrelevant to our aesthetic interactions with it. Okay. For example, when we look at a painting, we should consider only what is directly presented in our experience of it. What is really aesthetically relevant, therefore, is not what a painting symbolizes, but what it directly presents to experience. Okay, interesting. So the conclusion here, consider only what is directly presented. And then the therefore is key, right? So they're saying, based on this example and the premises that come before it, the symbolic elements of a painting are not aesthetically relevant. Okay, so this one's tricky. I think it's tricky to identify the last sentence as the conclusion. I think it might seem like the example is supporting the first two sentences, but when we look at the last sentence, the word therefore is really telling us that what comes before is the reasoning that supports the statement that's being made. And if we look at what the statement is that's being made, right, it's saying that what's aesthetically relevant, right, which, I mean, here they mention aesthetic relevance when they talk about extrinsic properties being irrelevant. And then they say it's not what the painting symbolizes. And they don't actually mention the symbolism part earlier, so that might be a bit of a gap. So we would have to make sure that we cover that gap, right? Because we have to make sure that symbolism in a painting is an extrinsic property rather than an intrinsic property. And so what a painting symbolizes is not something that is directly presented to us. But I do see how the last sentence is like bringing together, so the aesthetic relevance and the part about direct presentation, right? Like that's in the third sentence. So it's definitely bringing those parts together into the conclusion, but we also have a new kind of issue in the conclusion, which is what a painting symbolizes. So I would definitely be looking to add something to the premises that's going to connect that portion, and that's going to be able to bring us all the way to the conclusion. So that is something that you can kind of take into other questions of this type. Just looking at, is there some idea or entity that is mentioned in the conclusion that isn't mentioned yet in the premises? Because maybe that's, what we're missing support for, and so we need to add support that will bring that, like full circle. Okay, so what an artwork symbolizes involves only extrinsic properties of that work. So that would help. So I'm going to leave that for now. There are certain properties of our experiences of artworks that can be distinguished as symbolic properties. So here, this would confuse the issue further, right? This would actually weaken the argument, where, yeah, this one's kind of saying that our experience of an artwork and the symbolic properties are not mutually exclusive. So I would eliminate B. C, only an artwork's intrinsic properties are relevant to our aesthetic interactions with it. So we still have intrinsic and aesthetic, like those are parts that are like aesthetic interaction. Those are parts that are already like mentioned in the argument. They're not mentioned in this precise way, but that's something that we should be able to glean already from the other parts of the argument, because the support makes this very like clear distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic, right? So there are intrinsic properties and its other properties are the extrinsic ones, right? So by identifying the extrinsic ones as the other properties, we have the complete picture of all the properties that an artwork could have, intrinsic or extrinsic. So I would also eliminate C. D, it is possible in theory. I'm not really worried about the in theory part, right? Because we're talking about the like what's aesthetically relevant. So possible in theory for an artwork to symbolize nothing. No, they're not saying that paintings don't have symbolism, but just that their symbolism isn't relevant to our aesthetic interaction with the painting. So we shouldn't like pay attention to the symbolism when we're evaluating a painting aesthetically, I guess, or we're interacting with it aesthetically, experiencing it. So I would eliminate D. And then E defines intrinsic property. So that on its own is not going to get us all the way to the conclusion. And for the sake of this argument, we don't really need to define the terms intrinsic and extrinsic. We just need to know, as the premise tells us, that they are like two different things. So, and both of them together would cover all our artistic properties, right? So we have the intrinsic is like one part of the pie chart, and everything else is extrinsic. Yeah, so having the definition of intrinsic isn't going to make this argument totally work. Whereas A is going to get that symbolism bit from the conclusion and tie it into extrinsic properties. Yeah, so A is the correct answer. I hope that helps. Yeah, let me know if you want a deeper explanation on any of the answer choices. But yeah, that's how I would go about this question. Okay, great. Have a good one. Bye.